This episode of Film Feeder is brought to you by Entertainment Earth, the premier online shopping destination for all things pop culture. Stick around to hear more about the fantastic offer I have to help you begin building your collection today. Warning, this episode of Film Feeder contains heavy spoilers for the film at its center, so for those who don't want to know anything beforehand, then come back once you've had a chance to see it. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hello, one and all. I'm Jack Martin, your film chef extraordinaire, and welcome back to the newly revamped Film Feeder podcast. Now, in the past, this show has been all about highlighting all the movies coming to your screens every week. But since that proved to be quite a harrowing effort for little old me working on my lonesome, I've decided to change things up going forward. So, for one, episodes are now going to be monthly instead of weekly. And they'll also be focused on fascinating topics from within the world of film, whether it's looking at classic or less talked about films and why they're worth recommending, or whether they've held up or whatever, or discussing like a particular favorite movie star or director, or like, even an iconic cinema, or just about any film related topic that I happen to find interesting. And for this episode, this first episode, I should say, I thought I'd start out strong with an in-depth look at perhaps my favorite film of all time, the 1999 suburban drama American Beauty, which was the first film by director Sam Mendes, who was then primarily a theatre director, and stars the eclectic ensemble of Kevin Spacey, Annette Bening, Thora Birch, Wes Bentley, Minu Savari, Chris Cooper, and Alison Janney, which is quite an incredible cast in retrospect. But don't worry, everyone, because I am not alone on this venture. For joining me today over Zoom, all the way from Brooklyn, New York, we have actor, producer, filmmaker, founder of Noble Gas Media, and all-round cool person who was previously on the show to promote his recent horror film Brightwood. And it's Max Wortendyke. So, hi, Max. Welcome back to the show. How's everything on
Hey,
your end?
everything's great. Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to be here as part of this sort of new rebranding and relaunch for this new format.
Oh no, I'm really excited because I think it's a lot more freeing as well because I love talking about films and just really talking about the films that really hold dear to me is always such a pleasure. So thanks for joining me on this very first venture. So yeah, no, let's get right into it. So American Beauty, as I mentioned before, this has been for years now. This has been my favorite film of all time, and that's a lot, given what I do for a living. I talk about films all the time, but what American Beauty, it has always been right up there for me, and I'll get into reasons why later on. But yeah, I love just about everything about it. There's certainly things that can be talked about with it. I'm sure we'll touch upon them later on. Max, what are your thoughts on the film if you've seen it recently or if it's been a
Yes, sure.
while?
So it had been a while, and then I went back and watched it because I knew we were going to be doing this. And when it came out in 1999, I don't know. I don't remember if I saw it in theaters or not. I don't think I did. I think I saw it on probably DVD. And I remember having a really strong effect on me. I mean, I think, as an actor and as a teen at the time, you know, there was something about both the story and I think just the performances that I found very moving and very intriguing and exciting. I found, the film is beautifully shot. Obviously, I think it's very smartly written, very well crafted. Um, and so it had always stuck with me. It had been a while since I'd gone back. Obviously, there's sort of some, and I'm sure we'll get into this, some pall over it now, sort of given what we know now about Kevin Spacey that we didn't know then. Uh, but at the time, I was such a huge fan of his work,
Hmm.
and um, it was cool was coming back to it as an adult and watching it now in this thing through a different lens and still really thinking about I think all the things that are so wonderful about the film and really work about the film, and also the things that looking back on in 2024 you think, oh, this is you wouldn't make this movie the same way, or we're not used to seeing these characters presented in the lights that film shares them in. I think in this current day and age. So it was very exciting. It was a real pleasure to go back to.
Yeah, no, I watched it for the first time in a few years, just a few days ago in preparation for this, and there's a lot of it that certainly, takes on, like you said, just takes on a whole different lens in 2024, because obviously it's 25 years that this came out, which is kind of insane, like because 1999, I think it's widely regarded as like a banner year for film, because not just that, we had, stuff like Fight Club, Magnolia,
Well, I
you know,
went back to look at see like what else was coming out around that time. I mean, there were certain things about rewatching American Beauty where I thought like, right, this sort of idea of American suburbia, this sort of detachment of the middle class, this sort of things like, I mean, like Fight Club, or even in a couple of years prior, in a couple of years, you had Suburbia, the Eric Bogosian, based on the Eric Bogosian play in 96. You had Pleasantville in 98, which, is the same sort of thing of like, how do you find this? How do you find meaning in a suburban middle class life that seems so devoid of connection and meaning elsewhere? You get Donnie Darko in 2001. So 1991 is sort of this amazing, you know, bridge, at the end of the millennium, where we sort of, I think, a lot of these ideas were in the zeitgeist, in entertainment and culture.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I mean, it really hit. There's a lot of films in. I mean, you mentioned Fight Club. It hits on a lot of hit things about consumerism and just general nihilism, and then existential films like The Matrix, and then just all out assaults on issues of censorship, like the South Park movie does. So the list is ongoing, and honestly. But 1999 in particular, with American Beauty, there's so much that's obviously so much has changed in and of itself over the last 25 years. But American Beauty is one of those films I feel is both timeless, but also very much of its time. Like, I mean, the themes of the film are they're very universal. There's still a lot that needs to be talked about with them in today's culture. For example, I find the film is a very well, let's start from the beginning, first of all. I think those listening might not even have seen American Beauty. Let's fill them in on what the plot is. So, the plot of the film, like Max said, it takes place in suburbia, like an unnamed American town. I believe it was filmed around California. I think it's like the aerial shots you see at the beginning of the film and end of the film are like meant to be Sacramento, but it's never really stated exactly where this town takes place. This film takes place. So the film is about a man named Lester Burnham, who's played by Kevin Spacey. He's like like 40s, and he's kind of at a rut in his life. Like he's kind of unfulfilled, like he's in a job he detests. His wife doesn't like him, his teenage daughter especially doesn't like him. And the film really kicks off when Lester, of all things, takes a fascination in his teenage daughter's best friend, Angela Hayes, who's played by Mina Savari. And yeah, I mean that in and of itself can be seen as quite problematic. Obviously, a middle-aged guy like lusting after a underage teenage girl. It's very questionable, especially given what we now know about the
It,
actor.
it's definitely, yeah, it's definitely a surprising thing, to you just wouldn't imagine, I mean, anything that sort of is Lolita tinged, I mean,
Mm,
and I think that it's also worth mentioning that the structure of the film, you
mm,
know, takes some sort of classic structures and some theatrical structures. I mean, there's an opening monologue, from Lester Burnham, Kevin Spacey's character, and sort of sets up from the very beginning. It's sort of a carousel-esque introduction to the thing. It's this. There's this big, crane shot down from the sky down to this town, and he sort of is talking about where he is in his life, and he says in the first 5 minutes of the film, in a year and a half, I'll be dead. He reveals the end of the plot, really sort of before it begins, and he is sort of acting as a narrator in the afterlife, which I think is a kind of just a very interesting um, sort of framework for
mm.
the piece as well, that I think is worth mentioning. But yes, to have the inciting incident in a way for this entire film to be a 40-year-old's infatuation with a 15-year-old character, and to somehow frame it in a way that is humorous.
Mm.
And I don't know,
Oh,
Lester's character is comedic,
mm.
and he's engaging in a way. I did not find the character to be wholly repulsive in any kind of way, watching it even through this lens. And I found that surprising. I thought it was a film that demands some complicity from its audience, which is an interesting thing to be able to do.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because obviously, him lusting after this teenage girl is in and of itself a catalyst for him to really just kind of like bettering his life. He starts, working out. When she mentions, oh, maybe if he worked out more, like maybe I'll he'll be something. But like, so he starts working out. He starts smoking a lot of weed from next door neighbor, Ricky, who's played by Wes Bentley. He's a troubled kid. He has had some psychological issues, along with his father, who's Chris Cooper, who's this deeply homophobic Marine, who's quite abusive and quite controlling. I mean, we don't one of the things I think is interesting about how this all kind of relates back to the idea that all of this change for this main character, this Lester Burnham, it comes from something that is in and of itself quite juvenile. Like when he first meets Angela Hayes in the movie, it's really like just a teenage boy just like being speechless in front of their first crush, like, and it's which is weird because obviously he's a married man with a teenage daughter of his own. But in that moment, you really see him just kind of go back into prepubescent mode. So that's kind of like the seed that kind of grows up everything, and it just kind of bettering his life. He quits his job, he blackmails his boss for a good severance package, and he ends up working at a fast food restaurant. So it's really just I always found this film about just taking back like your own agency in life. Like I felt like it's really kind of saying, what, it's not too late to get that all back. They even say that early on in the film. But it's all about because there's a piece of set decoration very early on in the film that ended up being the film's tagline, which was "Look closer." Apparently, that wasn't originally meant to be part of the promotion, but I think they caught that on like a test screening or something, and then they just, it actually works well for the overall theme of the film because
Yeah,
you have to look closer to these characters.
I believe the first time you see it is actually when you're introduced to Lester at his job. It's like in the
Mm,
first 5 minutes of the film. He's sitting in a cubicle, trying to land a sale, and you can tell he's frustrated at work and it's not going so great, and he feels very stuck in a rut. And there's a little sign, tagged, a little aspirational, inspirational thing tagged to his wall that says "Look
mhm.
closer."
Yeah, and
It's
obviously
so
that became the tagline for the film and the unofficial slogan for it as well. But it's I mean that whole sequence in and of itself, all the scenes set in the office. Apparently, that's a lot of that is inspired by Billy Wilder's The Apartment,
hmm.
and I think a lot of Kevin Spacey's performance is modeled after Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon and all those classic
Oh,
actors.
I
Yeah.
think that makes so much sense. I mean, there's also clearly like his performance is a physical one. It's not just
Mm,
an emotional one. I mean, he creates this sort of the whole first half of the film, he's very, he's slumped over. I mean, really this kind of like the world of the weight on his shoulders.
mm,
He's given up. I mean, we say like the inciting incident is the beginning of this infatuation with Angela, but simultaneously it's also, the first time he smokes weed with Ricky outside of the real estate event, and he's
mm.
sort of amazed by this kid's confidence. It's sort of the combination of those two things. It's something about, you know, um, he's like, wow, he wants to be. I don't know. Is it that he wants to be young again? Is it he wants to feel like there's potential again? Um, Something that struck me rewatching the film is just genuinely how sad all the characters are, how lonely they all are. As funny as the film is, I think they're all desperately sad and
Yeah,
desperately isolated.
yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of that also comes from not just Kevin Spacey, but also Annette Bening, who plays Carolyn in the film, Lester's wife, who's this very ambitious real estate agent. She's competing with a much bigger real estate person, who she ends up having an affair with later on. And you see in this in quite an early scene, she's like attending the house that she's like showing various people, including John Cho.
John Cho, yeah, I know.
Yes.
An amazing silent extra walk-on
I
part.
know.
Yeah.
So it turns out there's two American Pie actors in American Beauty in the same year. So Mina Suvari and John Cho. So, but that you see her just kind of like really obsessively just getting the house in spot order, like with the mantra like I will sell this house today, and it's very robust. And then after she doesn't really succeed, there's this really quite unnerving shot. We'll talk about the cinematography in a minute because it's quite astounding, but you just see her just really kind of being way too hard on herself. Like you get the sense that this is a very screwed up person, quite mentally. Like you don't, it's never established how she got to this stage, but there's clearly something not quite right with this person because and that comes out in Benning's performance because this is a character that's certainly very over the top, very theatrical, very, I don't want to say cold-hearted because, there is definitely like passion within her. It's just buried underneath all this neurosis. But as it goes along, as her quite disturbed mental state kind of comes to the surface to the point where she is willing to just pull a gun on her own husband, it's just this is a deeply sad person who, like you said, just has a lot going on that we need to look closer at because it's not always as rosy as it looks on the surface.
No, I mean it's the desperation. I mean, every character in their way, I think, is very desperate in the film, and that obviously that's very clear in that scene, with her trying to sell the house. It's clear with Lester's need to feel a certain way. But even that character like Angela, is like the desperation of wanting to be a model,
Mm,
wanting to find success. And I think one of the things that's so interesting is that sense of desperation is hidden by the sort of pristine white picket fence, well curated lawns, the manicured world of the American suburb at this time. On the surface, everything looks good. There's something it reminds me of, a little bit of the opening of Blue Velvet. There's something a little Lynchian about sort of like what dark secrets are hidden beneath the surface of these perfectly trimmed roses and these sort of like well-crafted personas. I mean, uh, I think like that's at the heart of the film, and so their desperation is in direct contradiction to, like, if you just look at them on paper, it looks like, well, you guys have a nice car, you guys have a good job, you have a nice house. When we talk about the cinematography, I mean, the world that they're shown to live in is quite beautiful the way it's shot. There's some of these, and you have some of these like beautiful key lights on their faces. The first time he sees Angela, you can see them, or when Jane's sitting at the dinner table between her two parents in that scene when Lester's asking her about school. It's again in the first, I don't know, 10 minutes of the film, and both her parents are sort of in dark, and she's in this lighted. She must be lit from above, but she also has this great light on her face, this soft light on her face, and there's something sort of the angelicness or the softness of beauty and youth, I think, obviously a theme as well. But underneath that, what is it that is held? Also this is dark, but like I couldn't help but thinking, the very opening shots of the film are a digital video recording. It's like a handheld video camera recorder that
mhm,
Wes Bentley's character is interviewing Jane, and it's when the idea of he offers to basically murder her dad, and
mm,
it's impossible to not also think about, like, culturally, like, we're only a couple months after Columbine, which is
mm,
the first major school shooting in America, and this is a time also before the internet. So like digital video, the presence of a digital video camera, I think also in 1999, very different. The idea of being surveilled or voyeurism, much different than now, where like everyone and their mom is not only willing but eager to reveal their private moments in public on the internet. And here we are literally having a conversation between the two of us about this film, in the hopes that other people will watch us and listen to it. You know, I think like the in the time frame that this digital video camera, the surveillance aspect of it, which ends up playing a sort of very key pivotal role. You know, Wes Bentley's
Mm.
character records these sort of artsy, voyeuristic videos, and one of them that he takes of Lester ends up sort of becoming a real key to unlock a dangerous plot point. Um, comes up. I think is also an interesting thing to think about, like just what it meant to be watched, what it meant to be looked at, and how desperate people were to feel that someone else cared who they were or that they had something to offer. And there was no outlet aside from person to person relations.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well that you brought up, the whole being looked at thing, because when I studied at university, one of the things that I put into my main dissertation was the work of Laura Mulvey, how she talks about the male gaze, and there's a certain to be looked atness, I think she called it, with it when it comes to, looking viewing female people as like not necessarily couches, but just objects. And obviously, that's not the way that we should really think about women in general. But the point that Mulvey makes, I mean, it's a argument from nearly 50 years ago now, but it's still valid that there's a certain way that the camera frames female figures, as some kind of object to be desired. And that's very true in American Beauty as well. That the very first time that Lester sees Angela and goes into that kind of like weird fantasy, where she's like dancing seductively, like winking at him and just like unloading, just revealing her breast only to have the rose petals come out. That's very literally the male gaze in practice. That's so I think it's interesting to really kind of look back on that, having gone through all those kind of studies, and thinking like, wow, that this is and immediately establishes, how immediately he sees her as like something to be desired rather than her actual person, which is obviously not someone who, in and of itself, as we find out, is quite insecure about themselves, is quite insecure about their own looks, and so they really amplify, that they're sexually active when it turns out they're not. So
I mean, right. This is the whole fantasy is based on an idea of who she is. It has nothing to do with who she really is,
no.
and that's, I mean, in a way, the arc of that relationship, if you want to call it that, you know, the discovery of the realization of what who she actually is rather than who he would like to imagine her to be, and perhaps in the framing of the film, who she would like to present herself to be as well. And the falsity of that is sort of, but they get through the whole movie pretending, imagining something else. I was amazed in that opening moment when he first sees her. It reminded me, it's like a one-sided adult version of that West Side Story moment.
Mm.
When uh,
If Tony looked at Maria and just looked like, yeah, I just want to bang that,
yeah, and Maria had no idea what was going on and was like, 25 years younger than
Yeah.
he was, but even just the way Sam Mendes, who has a theatrical background, I think this is interesting. There's something about that moment that seems to be consciously or unconsciously a little bit of a throwback to that moment, that West Side Story moment.
Definitely. And like I think there's a lot of there's a big theme about sexual desire and repression all throughout, not just with Lester and Angela. There's also, Carolyn's affair with Buddy Kane, who's the big real estate king, and there's also Frank Fitz and his internalized homophobia, which obviously he turns out to be quite closeted himself. So there's a real dynamic that is a lot to do with sex in this film, because obviously, I mean, the only ones in the film who seem to have a healthy relationship, emotional or physical, is Jane and Ricky, because they are two souls who actually find the most in common and actually, seem happy with each other. And obviously Lester's not happy with Carolyn and vice versa, and Jane's not comfortable being around a more confident friend, and then obviously Ricky's not comfortable being around his domineering father, and her mother, who's Alison Janney as well. So that obviously it doesn't extend to the parents, but there is this kind of like need for need for sexual gratification with a lot of these characters that makes the dynamics a lot more interesting than if it was just, oh, we just kind of fallen out of love, or we're just not really friends anymore, that kind of thing. So, but
Yeah, I think it's like so fascinating this idea that Ricky and Jane are sort of like the best suited couple, and it
mm,
makes me think of that scene, at a certain point, Ricky's taken a video of Lester nudely working out in his garage,
hmm
and his father finds the video and flips out essentially and demands that he leave the house.
hmm
Sort of kicks him out. He thinks that this is a sign of his son's sexual proclivities, and Ricky doesn't deny it. And exactly as you say, sort of Frank Fitt's repressed own sexual identity, doesn't allow him to. There's no room for him. He feels he needs to be a certain way. And
mm.
Ricky goes to get Jane and sort of say, leave with me. And there's this amazing scene where she sort of says to Angela, we're freaks, we're always going to be freaks. And I just think it's so interesting that like the characters who self-defined that way in the film, and they're like, they seem more, what you would maybe now call like, they're a little more emo. They're a little more like gothy, they're, they have dark hair. They're not blondes.
Yeah.
And really just in the sort of visual world of the film.
Oh yeah, I knew so many kids at my school who were like that. So like, I
I
mean,
mean, I was one of those kids at my school to some degree, and just so interesting that their self-definition as these sort of the freaks against the world kind of
Mhm.
trope, or kind of archetype.
Mm.
But then in some ways, yeah, their relationship does seem like the most honest, at least,
Yeah,
or
yeah, especially
clearest.
especially for Jane, because obviously when we meet her, she's like, the typical like moody teenager. She's not confident about her image. She's looking at like getting like breast augmentation, and then when she comes across Ricky, who kind of has this kind of very odd but kind of different, unique view of the world, she eventually finds someone who's kind of on her same level as well. And as here's an interesting tidbit I apparently picked up in looking at trivia. Apparently, I can't remember the exact order, but I think so what between Jane and Angela, I think one has more prominent makeup and the other one less. And then as the movie progresses, the roles reverse. I mean, one has less makeup and the other one has more. So that was an interesting little tidbit I picked up, and I think there's so much else, in terms of like there's also a lot, because let's face it, a lot of these characters in their own way, they are pretty self-absorbed, in that kind of late 90s, like the world's against me kind of thing. I mean, Lester is, Carolyn certainly is, it's a film about, partially the dangers of self-absorption in current society. And I think it's just a very humorous way of looking at how all these different egos clash with one another.
Well, right, it's like the self-obsession,
Mm,
of your own identity in the world coming out of a feeling of alienation, and the sort of alienation of and there are films over the decades about alienation. I mean, one of the things I think is interesting is it suggests that alienation is possible for both sort of adults and youth in this film, that it's sort of a societal issue that bridges generations, that it's not the purview of, it's not just like Sid and Nancy, it's not just the
mm.
punks, it's not just one sort of subgroup, that it's that a sense of alienation is pervasive among an entire group of people, regardless of age, and in some cases even sort of class to varying degrees. I think here, although I think they are all suburban middle class people.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a lot of middle class personalities that I think, might not necessarily have aged that well with ever changing economic values, but obviously we'll get more into that later on. But there's so many. I mean, beyond the fact that, because this is a script by Alan Ball, who obviously went on to create shows like 6 Feet Under and True Blood, and also wrote the films Towelhead and Uncle Frank. I think he directed those films as well. So I mean, there's so much depth to this script, and he rightfully won the Oscar for it. But I think in general, it's an incredibly crafted film. You know, because you look at so many technical aspects like the acting, cinematography, direction, editing, the score. It's a phenomenally put together film by extremely talented individuals, and you were talking a lot about earlier about the cinematography of the film, and that comes courtesy of Conrad L. Hall, who was a very prominent cinematographer. He did everything from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to Cool Hand Luke, and also he also worked with Sam Mendes one more time on Road to Perdition, which he won a posthumous Oscar for. And like you said, the cinematography in this film, I think one of the things I picked up on when I watched it the other day was just how exact and how precise the lighting is. Like I talked about that scene earlier with Annette Bening, being slapping herself and yelling at herself and all that, but the way that it's shot is it's in a dark room, but there's a kind of like a light, faint light just on her face. So obviously to help the audience see more what kind of emotions she's going through. But it really opens up a huge window into this character just moments after meeting her.
There's also this amazing thing. I mean, so in that scene, she's closing up the back glass windows to the patio. She's failed at selling the house, despite her like, I'm going to sell this house. She's been doing these self-affirmations to no avail. And she closes these glass doors to the patios, pulls the curtains behind her, which are Venetian blinds. So you sort of like go from this bright, she's silhouetted against the light, closed, you sort of see the shafts of light coming through. And then, yeah, there's this glow, which is not a practical light in the room. It's like we don't know where that it's really coming from. And in this, and I think there's a number of cases in the film where that happens. And she has this it's an extreme close up, and we see her slapping her face and this glow. And immediately we cut right afterwards, this very intimate, private moment to this brightly lit, wide moving shots taking place at a basketball game. And
Yeah.
so we move straight from, this sort of like very private moment, darkly, dimly lit, to this very public moment, very brightly lit too. And I think the film has a number of cases where it uses those cut the way it's cut as well, to sort of move us from space to space, both emotionally and literally, physically.
Yeah, and there's also, the fact that there's the regular recurring motif in the film is obviously the roses of the American Beauty rose, the petals even. And the way that they're incorporated into all the fantasy sequences that Lester has about Angela, that famous image of her, up on the bed of petals, just looking
I
down
mean,
on
it's
him in
funny. I
bed.
mean, it's the same image from Train Spotting
Mm.
with the dead baby on the ceiling. I mean, like literally, it's the same image. That he when he's when he's coming out of his dope. He's in withdrawal. It's a
Mm.
kind of interesting thing about like the addiction of the feeling, Frank's addiction to this fantasy. There
Mm.
is literally again, I have no idea whether this is conscious or not. Just when I resaw that scene, I couldn't help but think of that scene of Ewan McGregor on the bed staring at the baby on the ceiling. It's there is a reference there, whether the artist meant to or not. There's a cultural reference, I think, for us now, and that I think holds.
I have to admit, all those years of just seeing that image of Mina Savari on the rose petal flowers on the book, I never would have gone to the mind of, oh, actually, it's looking a lot like that scene with a dead baby in it. So
Listen, I can't, I can't help where my mind goes sometimes.
no, that's fine. I mean, Trainspotting is a great film too, but that's just a connection I never really thought about. I mean, yeah, but I mean, both are kind of like involve ceilings and kind of like weird fantasies. Obviously, the one in American Beauty is a lot more wholesome than the one with all
Well,
the.
I would say, I think there's an argument that you could say, I mean, I don't know if I would use the word wholesome. I think in both of them, there are cases that are involved ultimately,
Mm,
though, about feelings of like fantasy, guilt, shame, and addiction, desire, like,
mm,
you know, one of them in American Beauty, he's like going into the addiction,
Mm.
and in Trainspotting, he's coming out of the addiction. Which maybe we can suggest why the Rose Petal one seems such more pleasant for sure than the Trainspotting Dead Baby.
If you're listening to this, then congratulations, you're now halfway through the episode. But before we continue, I want to give a special shout out to this episode's sponsor, Entertainment Earth. If, like me, you're absolutely obsessed with all things pop culture and want to own some fun collectibles and memorabilia, then Entertainment Earth has you covered with thousands of action figures, Funko Pop figurines, prop replicas, and plenty more in stock from all sorts of popular franchises like Star Wars, Transformers, James Bond, and beyond. Being something of a Marvel fan myself, I'm particularly excited about the upcoming release of Deadpool and Wolverine, so imagine my delight when I found plenty of Deadpool toys and accessories to choose from at a reasonable price, including some newly released Funko Pops featuring both Deadpool and Wolverine in their costumes from the forthcoming movie, and I've linked to those particular items in the description if you're eager to complete your collection. As you can already tell, Entertainment Earth is an absolute treasure trove of pop culture goodness that ships all over the world, with a groundbreaking mint condition guarantee that ensures you're always receiving the best quality item, as well as a 90-day return policy that's completely hassle-free. What's more, if you go to ee.toys/filmfeeder, FILMFEEDR, link in the description, you can get 10% off all in-stock items, as well as free shipping, US only, for all orders over $79 until June 30th. So there's no better time to begin your risk-free shopping spree than right now. Once more, that's ee.toys/filmfeeder, FILMFEEDR, for 10% off all in-stock items. And thanks once again to Entertainment Earth for sponsoring this episode. Speaking of which, let's get back to the show. So yeah, I mean, there's so much about the cinematography that's just outstanding in the film. Obviously, we talked about the everything with how it uses lighting and certain fantasy sequences. I think for me, I mean, the big takeaway from this film has always been the musical score. I think Thomas Newman is a composer that I have a lot of respect for. I think he has produced a number of beautiful scores throughout his career, from Road to Perdition and Finding Nemo, and even as recently as Pixar's Elemental. The score he does for American Beauty is most iconic for a reason. It's got incredible blends of kind of like all these kind of like instruments and just melodies that you hear throughout. It's just I was listening to it again on Spotify and I was just thinking like, wow, this is, when you take it out of context for the film, it's actually very soothing music. It's incredibly whimsical in its own way, and it's also just it puts you in a very, hopeful mood, which is strange to say about obviously all the directions it goes in. But that's how I feel about, just every time I listen to the musical score, whether it's in context of the film or not, and it's always just it's like audible bliss for me every single time I listen to it.
It's the drum tracks are the ones that stand out most to me.
Mm,
And they're sort of like kind of they're a little frenetic, but there's like a little teasing. There's something like a little sort of freeform jazzy about it. And those are always the ones I think that when I think about the music of the film, sort of stick most to me. They sort of feel like the thoughts stemming in the characters' brains.
mm.
Um, I've never listened to the score sans the film, so that's is an interesting exercise to feel like how it feels different without its relationship to the visuals.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to really kind of, I mean, it's a very, I mean, Thomas Newman is a very masterful kind of musician in and of himself, but I mean, there are certain ways like the main thing that that plays over the beginning, that simple melody, ding 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 ding. It kind of sounds like the iPhone ringtone now that I think about
Sure, totally.
it, but it does so well with blending just these kind of like unearthly instruments. It sounds like obviously, like you said, the drums, but there's also like a bit of electronic in there. And
Hmm.
whenever it's in the fantasy sequences, it's these very kind of warped, I don't even know what you call them. They're not too refined for strings, and it's a very unrecognizable sound. I know, I'm sure it's a comes from an identifiable instrument, but how it sounds in the film is very not of this world, I should say, which makes sense because it's a fantasy. When he goes into the bathroom and sees Mina Sabari in the bath, and obviously whenever he's like when he's seeing her for the first time at that basketball show, the music just has a way of really just getting you into these very strange mindsets that the characters are on. I mean, the very first time we see Ricky, it's this very kind of gentle and haunting kind of little melody that really kind of brings out the tragedy of the character, but also like the underlying hopefulness.
There's a surrealism to I think to so much of the music. And it makes me think, I hadn't thought about this previously, but thinking about those opening sequences and Lester's sort of return to Earth is sort of this narrator character. I think there's also this question of like what we're seeing is, how reliable of a narrator is he? Who is telling the story? What the perspective of the camera is? Like, who is the watcher in this sense? Who is the person who is structuring the way the story is told to us? And it is just by nature of that opening monologue, it is sort of from a Lester's posthumous experience, at least our introduction to it. And something about the music, I think you're right. There is something otherworldly, I think was a phrase you used.
Mm,
And something a little surreal about it that that colors those moments, and perhaps in a way that, like, looking back on the idea of like looking back on these moments to find the significance of them. If maybe there's something related to that idea that hearing them with the music, it colors them in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be so clear in the first living of them without that underscore.
mm. I mean, it works great in the context of the film as well. But I definitely recommend just about anyone listening, to seek out the score, on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever it may be available, and just kind of like have it on in the background, and then just kind of like listen to how the music how it sounds, and just the kind of emotional core that it really kind of mean how it gets to you, because I think it's worth hearing just even outside the context of the film. So and that's always been like a top musical score in my life. Like it's been such every time I hear it, I think it's like wow, it's like a transportation thing. Like I know it sounds really high horsey to say, but like it really is that kind of wow, I can't believe this person got away with this, really. Um, but no, I think I mean, we touched upon a lot about like many of the technicals and obviously the direction by Sam Mendes for his first film. To come out with this is quite, and to win an Oscar for it, all these awards, and it really feels like something that was made by a seasoned pro at that point. Which obviously kind of he was. He obviously, like he said, he worked in theatre, but this was his feature debut, and it could have gone like been felt very stagey and felt very like not exactly with the film language, but he really found a way to make it work. And there's so many little touches that he puts on screen with the certain inflictions of the characters, how certain images are framed, and how it really kind of holds together and never really becomes melancholic. I think it sets the template for a lot of what Sam Mendes would go on to do, because obviously he went on to do like films like Revolutionary Road and Skyfall and 1917, Empire of Light, and now he's working on that four-part Beatles movie,
Yeah.
which sounds interesting. But you can see all the seeds for what he does in those films and more in this film, and I think he's a profound filmmaker anyway, but I think that to come out with this as his first film is it's quite something, because there's so many people who don't exactly get it right on the first go. But yeah, he's one of the many who managed it.
It's definitely a distinct opening. It's like, hey, I'm here. It's a notice of arrival, for sure. And obviously, I think we've talked about this a little bit already, but obviously his background in the theater, I think you can see it in the way some of the film is shot, and some of the way it's seen. And I'm sure, in the way he worked with his actors. And I mean, the performances that he pulls out, I think, are really, really remarkable to, and interesting, and work really well together. And obviously also reading, like, they had to fight to get him be okayed by the studios, to by DreamWorks, to be the director on the film. $15 million budget. I looked it up, so that's a $28 million budget in today's dollars.
Mm.
um you know this is, I think, just generally thinking about, like, these questions of, like, what kind of movies get made today. $30 million film for a first time film director, with a cast that stacked. Now, I guess, like, none of them were as famous then as they all are to us now, but I think it says something also just about the kind of risks that studios were willing to take ultimately at that time, that I think we is harder for them to take now.
Mm.
For a film that size, taking a risk on that director, taking a risk on a film that's really an original concept. I mean, Alan Ball wrote the script in a way, as just a sort of a sample. The intention was for him to just shop it around so people could see, like, oh, what he's capable of. I think it wasn't written with the idea of going immediately into production. And it took a lot of executives, I'm sure, a lot of sort of guts to sort of continue to say yes to this series of things that allowed this movie to come to fruition, which obviously sort of paid off for everyone involved.
It really did, like, because the film, I think it had one of its premieres at the Toronto Film Festival, and then it won the Audience Award, which, for those who don't know, is like you often a good indicator of what will be nominated for or even win Best Picture. Like, past winners of it, in recent winners have included films like I think Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which obviously went on to be nominated, and then I think recently we've had films like Belfast pop up, and also I believe The Holdovers was on the runner-up list this year, and yeah, even Green Book won the Audience Award that year. I mean, regardless on your thoughts on that film, like, I mean, it's obviously a massive point for that film to be recognized at film festivals and go on to achieve such buzz, and then obviously go on to all that awards glory, and then on top of that, the film was a massive box office hit. It grossed like $350 million worldwide on you said, on a $15 million budget at the time, which is like 20 million now. So, I mean, there was, or at least in 1999, there was an audience for this kind of mid-budget film. And we touched upon this last time you were on the show. Because we brought up, the fact that, mid-budget films are increasingly rare. It's always like blockbusters or small artsy independent cinema, and like it's there's not as much of a balance now as it was back then, and there's obviously plenty of conversations to be had about just the nature of mid-budget filmmaking in general nowadays. But I think it's important to bring up because it's not healthy to have like just one thing or the other all the time, like there's got to be like a middle ground.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, we look at $350 million, box office on worldwide. The most obvious thing to say, which is of course true, is that in 1999, people couldn't go onto their computers or onto
Mm,
their smart TVs and pick whatever they wanted from a bajillion titles over the past 60 years.
mm,
Going to the theater was still like, it was an activity. It was like people went to the movie theaters on dates. People went to the movie theaters as families. People went to the movie theaters on a Saturday night. And so, I mean, I think there was just a different movie going culture there. And that's not to in any way take away from just the sort of the impact or the success of the film still on the budget its size, to do over 10x on it is like pretty remarkable. It's a different model now. I
mm.
mean, I think, we're gonna the studios are gonna have to start making some more mid-budget movies because they can't afford to make 150 to $100 million movies and then just shove them on a streamer. I mean, we're already
Mm,
seeing this. This has been happening over the past year. A lot
mhm.
of these larger projects are sort of getting shelved or trimmed down. But again, it's like there is something about, I think, the creative bravery of the executives, around this film to sort of like take a series of chances, and part of that is just cultural, part of that's just of the time, is the economy was different than it is now, the business model is different than it is now, and there's obviously a lot of factors that lead to, I think, people's worries about the kind of content they put out now and what the limitations are. But again, just to make a $15 million film with this subject matter by, a first time film director, by a writer who was not at the time, is not who he is today,
Mm.
certainly, cast some of these, still fairly unknown or relatively unknown actors. Certainly not, like huge box office stars yet.
Mm.
Um, and for like some of that in deals with these like serious issues. It's funny, you look it up now and it says, it's a comedy and a romance is the genre of the film, which is, it definitely speaks to a different mindset in 1999 than now. If anything, I think it sort of feels like a drama and a satire now, even though it is funny, but it's sort of satirical elements. But it had people wanted to go and see it. And people did go to see it. People paid their money to go see it.
Yeah, it's just a huge win for independent film at that time and just in general.
I mean, in a funny way, actually, if we think about like what are comps now, for like a risky kind of take in a film that's, in a similarly sort of budgeted thing, and honestly, the closest thing I can think of, which is nothing at all like this film as a film, but, it's like the people who decide to okay anything, anywhere, and everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah, I
What a
was thinking the exact
weird,
same thing. I was thinking the exact
really.
same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Because it's like what a brave thing to greenlight that film. You're like a film about a giant bagel of nothingness at the center of a universe that centers around, a kung fu martial arts movie that takes place in the IRS building. I mean, it's
Yes.
like what a weird, crazy fucking thing to pitch, and someone said yes to, and the subject matter of American Beauty is, I think like what I'm advocating is not, for someone to make movies like American Beauty now, but for people to make movies that require the same kind of guts as it took to do American Beauty then to do now, and everything everywhere all at once, I think is an example of that. And
Yeah,
it did great at the box office.
and people went to see it, and it won Oscars. I mean,
Yeah.
both this and American Beauty won Best Picture, and Kevin Spacey won Best Actor, Sam Mendes Best Director. I'm still pissed that it never won Best Score. I can't even remember what won that year, but
I have no idea.
it wasn't Thomas Newman, and that makes me sad. But obviously it did a huge. I mean, there is certainly an appetite for mid-budget films. I mean, like you said, the recent success of Everything Everywhere All at Once is an incredibly accurate representation of that. And I think even over Christmas, the film Anyone But You with Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell, which what didn't cost huge amounts. I think it was about I can't remember how much that movie made to make, but it certainly wasn't like massively expensive. But that was a film that obviously relied a lot on its two lead actors, Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell. And that film obviously really hit a lot of notes with a lot of audiences, and it became a massive sleeper hit over the festive
and
period.
right, and it and has a long tail. I
Yeah.
mean, a film that, this is like, not to get too much into the weeds, but it's also, you look at American Beauty, 350 million worldwide box office. It doesn't even begin to take into account DVD sales. It doesn't even
Mm.
begin to take into account, any of those sort of ancillary income streams. And the Sydney Sweeney, Glenn Powell film, I think has proven to have a long tail and has proven to be able to convert audience across different windows. And I mean, I think this is something that unfortunately during the pandemic, the sort of big players is, they axed windows because they lost theatrical. Theatrical wasn't even possible. And I think everyone in just the rush of the panic, because what a crazy time, was like, great, we're all in. We want to get content to the people. The most optimistic view is we want to get content to the people. ASAP, you know, and it meant just like getting rid of the idea of windowing, and it just meant that there was less opportunities for people to see it in a variety of ways. And I think it makes the shelf life on films shorter, generally, it's like can be a number one hit on Netflix for a week or two, but by the end of those 2 weeks, there's something else in its place. And, just sort of, I think it's harder to find films that have a staying power, a lasting power. It'll be interesting to see which films we're talking about in 25 weird people will be talking about in 25 years from now.
Mm.
What films are coming out now that in 25 years are going to warrant an hour-long discussion about them, um, and which ones aren't.
Yeah, I think like I think more people are definitely going to remember something like American Beauty and even Everything Everywhere All at Once, more than something like off the top of my head, The Gray Man. That movie on Netflix that cost 200 million and nobody really remembers or cares about.
Yeah.
I think yeah, that's just the thing. But I mean, there's so much about American Beauty that I think holds up anyway, but obviously there's a lot that really doesn't. So we're going to talk about that. So shall we talk about the Kevin Spacey in the room? Shall we?
Sure. Yes. Sure. 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 Sure.
Yeah, because
Um,
we mentioned earlier, his character having an infatuation with a person who's significantly younger than him. Boy, does that not age well in 2024.
no, I mean, and it's obviously just colored so much by what we've learned about his own, behaviors on sort of
Mm.
sets continuously. Which is just a shame. He's really good in the film, and he was good in a lot of films in
Yeah, he's
these
great.
times. It was one of those. Yeah, it was one of those bummers. It was like a fall for grace for me, as
Mm.
as a young actor. His style of acting was a style of acting that I really admired. Like I loved him in Usual Suspects. Loved
Mm.
him in this. I loved him in a lot of stuff, and I got to meet him once. He came to school. He's a Juilliard grad like I am, and he came to school once, and while he was doing the world tour of Richard III. And at the time, like even then, I guess there were rumblings, but I didn't know anything. Mainly, he seemed like at the time sort of like a megalomaniac. But it's also hard to differentiate. That's also who Richard III is to some
Mm.
degree, and it's a little hard to differentiate between the two. But um, a real shame, a real fall from grace, given the sort of circumstances of his personal life, combined with what I think in the lens of 2024 really looks sort of like grooming behavior.
It,
you
it
know
is. It really is. There's a lot of very suspect grooming behavior going on with him, and him being like all flirty with Angela, and and then the scene
I
where
mean,
they
for
were.
Christ's sake, in the beginning of the film, his daughter's taking a shower. He
Mm.
goes into her room, looks through her diary, calls up, calls her, and hangs up. I mean, this is like bizarre, sick behavior. Funny enough, Ricky fits out. I was laughing too. Ricky at one point writes Jane's name and sets it on fire outside the window, and
Yeah.
and we're meant to believe like
Then
oh,
there's a
this is like
summary.
an act of romantic kind
Yeah.
of this is a
What?
say anything moment.
Yeah. They think it's Say Anything, but it's actually the movie Fear with Mark Wahlberg. Just
Yeah, it's really that.
Ricky's just one scene away from doing the chest thumping, like.
I mean, totally. And the normalization of that sort of like, for lack of a better phrase, like really sort of toxic male behavior,
Oh yeah, one of the interesting things I picked up on that rewatch, there's a lot about Lester Burnham's like arc, deciding he wants to take matters into his own hands, kind of like not really be a bit more aggressive and all that stuff. There's a lot of seeds you can point out to like incel behavior as well. Like there's like he's kind of like turning into this like alpha male kind of figure, just on who's kind of a bit more, confident in life, which is on the one hand is great, but like on the other hand, there's I've seen so many people online who like adopt this behavior and like look up to the horrible people like Andrew Tate as like role models and just that kind of I can see that kind of like behavior. Obviously, it wasn't big then as it is now, but like I can see that kind of behavior being implanted as well in the seeds of society. Like it was a bit uncomfortable to say
I mean, I
that.
think it's like, it's so strange. It's like, again, it's like a pre-internet time. I
Mm.
mean, so, like 1999, not only, people's personas there was only one place to have a persona, and it was in the real world.
Mm,
Obviously your persona could change depending on who you're with. We all put on different masks, but no one had this sort of ability to hide behind a screen and like be their avatar.
mm,
And I mean, Fight Club, I think there's like a similar cultural argument. Like when I saw Fight Club as a young man, I thought this is fucking awesome,
mm,
and yeah, I want to come into my own power. I want to be, whatever this is. I want to have, feel in control of my life, really,
mm.
and I think like, the sort of some of the most toxic people online now, like Jordan Peterson or whoever, and
Yeah, and Andrew
the
Tate, yeah.
entry point,
Mm,
right, it seems sort of innocuous of being like, well, don't you want to take control of your life? And
mm,
like, who doesn't want to take control of their life? And that's what all these characters in this film are trying to do. Of course, then from that starting point, it becomes, well, let's also take control of other people's lives.
mm.
And, I think this is where it becomes really kind of sick and domineering. And, but yeah, I laughed to think about that Ricky Fitz scene where it's like he does this grand romantic gesture, and you're like, oh, this is psychotic behavior.
Oh, it really
Like,
is. Like
this is really bizarre, scary behavior.
it
But
is.
for the characters in the film, that's not what's happening,
I will say that moment where he does like Jane's name and fire, that was the only part that I felt was a little bit out of character for Ricky, only because he doesn't seem the type to actually like do something that psychotic. I mean, he definitely has psychological issues, but he's always just there with his video camera, just filming everything. Like he films dead birds and stuff, but there's a reason behind it. Whereas,
I mean, right, but it's like even that introduction, our first introduction to him is
mm,
sitting in the dark in his, besides the very opening sort of teaser,
mhm,
sitting in the dark on his porch as a new neighbor,
mm,
covertly videoing his neighbor who's a teenage girl
yeah.
without her permission, without any introduction. And you're like, this is again, we were talking earlier about like, what a camera meant then means something different now. And
Hmm.
this idea of voyeurism in like personal versus private space. But I mean, if you introed a character like that today,
Mm.
an audience, I think, would very immediately jump to different kinds of conclusions
Oh yeah.
about who they are than audiences did in 1999. And I think like that's just interesting that if if you want to introduce a Ricky Fitz type character now, if you introduce him that way, I just think like what the message it sends to us, to our brains, the way we perceive that character is vastly different because we're so much more aware
Mm.
of the sort of imbalance of power and the male gaze and what it means to be objectified. And I think we're more aware of it. Part of that is because we have an online culture that allows for much easier dissemination of information, for both better and for worse, I think. And it's just like those things about the film have a kind of very like 1999 stamp on them,
Mm.
oh, it's cute and romantic, like, right, filming dead birds, cute, romantic, filming the classic, the famous thing, the artsy shooting the bag,
Mm.
and like we've become so accustomed to people filming everything in their lives that it like no longer, feels even vaguely would no longer feel even vaguely artsy. It would feel trite,
Mm.
to do it now and feel like self-important and like kind of just sort of gross and self-involved. But I
Oh
think at
yeah.
the time I felt this, like I was like, oh, wow, he's like a sensitive soul.
Hmm.
He's sensitive. He wants to watch. He's curious about people. He says, I'm curious or interested. And that's what makes him different than so many of the other characters in the film from Jump, is that he is introduced as a character who is curious about other people rather than obsessed with himself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's Ricky is a character that, I mean, like you said, could have so easily been taken the wrong way from the get-go. Like you said, he is introduced just filming people without their permission and lighting people's names on fire in their lawn and doing all this weird stuff. But he's definitely humanized as the film goes along. But You're right. If that was made like 25 years on, then yeah, that would be that would be very problematic in the same way that, I don't know, you couldn't, I don't think you could make a film like Blazing Saddles today, which
Oh, I
again,
mean,
very different film.
you definitively couldn't. And like,
No.
and I don't know that that's a bad thing either. It's like we grow, we evolve. This is, I mean, I think there's value to being able to see where we came from as a society without undermining the creative and artistic merit and value of those things also. I mean, the reason you can't introduce Ricky Fitz like that now in my mind, isn't because it's wrong or incorrect. It's because it doesn't help tell the story in the right way. Because an audience is going to have different assumptions now than they would have had in 1999. And if you're trying to tell a story about the things you're trying to tell a story about, you want to make sure that your audience is on board. It's just like, as artists, we need to not be so self-involved that we think, what the audience's perception doesn't matter. Of course it does.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a lot to really take on board. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from our own past, and as long as people remember that, it's just like not just shove it all under the rug. We do need to acknowledge it if we're ever able to change, because those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, or however the saying goes. But
I think just like that.
yeah. And but after all that, I do strongly recommend this film to anyone listening who's made it to this point and thinking like, should I see this? But I do think it's worth checking out because ultimately I feel that this is a film that is very life affirming. Like I saw this film for the first time when I was about 16 or 17, so really kind of in that phase where I'm really just trying to like watch a lot of films that aren't necessarily my particular age group or whatever. But I remember being so struck by this. The fact that this guy is making attempts to better his life. Just like standing up to his wife more, being more active. Being more having more agency in his life and for me at the time, because I really felt that as growing up with someone with autism, it's very difficult to kind of get a gauge on the world. Like I feel that it's very difficult to make your own judgments. Even now, as a 30 something year old man, I have difficulty, deciding things for myself, and it's films like this, whether or not the jumping off point is necessarily the right thing, it is about someone who ultimately does decide, what, I'm actually going to improve things for myself, whether it works out for me or not. And I think that's a very in its own way, it's a quite inspiring and uplifting. Yeah, even though it doesn't work out for him in the end, because he dies, like, and it's but he dies at the moment where he realizes, actually, you know what, I am fulfilled. I have everything I could possibly need in life, and obviously doesn't get to experience that because, again, gunshot to the back of the head, bam. But I've always found that so moving, and obviously that ending sequence in and of itself, combined with the score and the way that the camera zooms over like all these different parts of his life, and it's just again that aerial footage of the town, just going up before the cuts to black. I always felt so moved by that because I felt like it was a film that it didn't, not that it spoke to me necessarily, but it was empathetic to how I was feeling. Like I really needed to make my own decisions in life and to whether to better myself or to just stay things as it were. But yeah, that's really what I always took away from it. And even today, I find it a really kind of oddly endearing film to rewatch because, I'm at the point where, things aren't going well for me in my personal life and it's very difficult. And films like this remind me of like, yeah, actually, yeah, you can still do this. So that's how I view this film anyway. How about you?
Yeah, I would say I think it's definitely worth a watch. I mean, it's an incredibly well-made film, and everyone who's like in it, regardless of anything else, is like very good at what they do in the film. I think the performances are great, and I think they're human. The thing that brought me to, the theater and to film, and one of the things that made me want to be an actor originally was I really loved people trying. I loved watching people who I felt were trying their best and failing miserably at
Mm.
doing it. That's like what I always want to see in the art and entertainment that I consume, unless I'm just looking for like a popcorn flick and whatever, that's something else. But, I want to see people trying their best and failing miserably. I think that's what the human condition is kind of like. And I like being reminded that the human condition is one that's shared by us. And I think if that worldview doesn't upset you in a way that feels bad for you, then film is really worth checking out. It's incredibly well made, and I think it's a fun story, and I think it's still funny. There are moments now that I think are funny in a different kind of way. You think like, oh Jesus Christ, like, oh my God, like how can you be allowed to do this? Kevin Spacey has this spit take when he finds out that
Mm.
Angela's staying over as having a sleepover with his daughter for the first time, and I just put my head in my hands. I thought, oh my God, like, how do you not, just the lack of awareness from the character, even that
Mhm.
how inappropriate this is, but I think if you can detach yourself from that in a way, and then you can find the humor in it too, and remember that like us as human beings are sort of like silly creatures wandering a little aimlessly across the earth, like doing our best to make meaning out of things. And I think like you can find meaning in that. And I think, the meaning is up to you to determine what it is. But I think it's crafted wonderfully well. And I was happy to do a rewatch.
Yeah, so was I. And I think that's honestly a great place to end this rather in-depth look at American Beauty. So, Max, thank you so much for joining me
Thanks
in
for
this.
having me. This is really fun.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this. I've hopefully we can get you back on the show, talk about other stuff as well. Because
Sure, let's talk
honestly,
about The Conversation. That's 50 years old now.
yeah, that's a film I've never seen. I've always
Oh
wanted
my
to see
God. Let's do this about The Conversation. 50
it.
years, really worth watching. Not any more worth watching than American Beauty, but fantastic fucking film.
All
50
right.
years old, and I think like an amazing example of how a thriller shares information and doles that out, and keeps an audience on tender hooks, and curious.
Mm.
Keeps an audience curious. So how do we all get to be like Ricky Fitz and watch a movie curiously?
Oh yeah, you know what? That's one I'm putting high up on my watch list now. So,
Amazing.
but thank you, Max, for joining me. And are there any places that listeners can find you on social media?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm on Instagram at Woertendyke. That's the primary place to find me right now. Noble Gas Media, my company, we're in the process of getting sort of all of our stuff set up. We produced Brightwood and is now working on other projects, so we're sort of going to be doing a more official launch, probably early next month. So looking forward to being able to. We have a bunch of stuff in the works, and we're excited to put that out into the world as well.
That's amazing. And obviously, you can find all the links and handles to those in the episode description. I think, yeah, thank you very much for joining me, all of you, for listening. And I don't know what I'll be covering next month, but I really like this new format. I'm definitely going to keep it up. And I find it's a lot more freeing as well, just talking about everything film and with great guests as well. So yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much, Max, once again, for being my sous chef today. And that's all for now. See you next time. Hey, you've made it to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for sticking around. Please like and subscribe on whichever platform you may be listening on. Make sure that you're following Film Feeder on all our social media channels, the links and handles to which are all listed in the episode description. And do consider becoming a paid patron at patreon.com/filmfeeder for as little as $4 a month. Finally, don't forget to visit the Film Feeder website at filmfeeder.co.uk, where every week I post written reviews and handy movie menu roundups of all the newest releases coming to cinemas, streaming and on demand here in the UK. Until next time, I'm Jack Martin, your film chef extraordinaire, whetting your appetite for film each and every month. Bye for now.